Welcome to Season 2 of Bards Atlas. Tonight's episode is a submission from guest author Brooks Mitchum. Enjoy.
Incoming message. New database submission imminent. Bard designation.
Fox.
Log ID.
Negative? This is more Eli's thing. How did he do this again? Open, Chronicle submission.
Log Protocol 7 initiated. Begin Chronicle submission. Confirm and identify source.
The source ID, and I can't believe I'm doing one of these, is Fairwild's Fables.
Compiled. Please identify current entry of Chronicle submission.
This is one of the earlier works, a short story, the last entry in one of the first books, right before the Fables got all depressing and mopey, at least in my opinion, which is correct, of course. Anyway, let's get this over with before someone catches me submitting a Fairwild. Gosh, I can't imagine the shame.
Compiled. Begin submission.
The given title is The Picnic.
A young man exited his small home, holding an old wooden picnic basket and a blanket draped over a single arm. His words formed a fine, shimmering cloud as he sighed. Almost time. He walked briskly down a small stone path leading towards an old, decrepit street, pulling his coat tightly around him as he did. From his pocket he pulled a small, clear panel, which read the words, "Delivery arriving," as the listed time ticked up one more talk. He looked up past the light drift of snow falling from the gray clouds which were faintly bathed in the sun's dim winter glow and cut by thin, towering, rusting skyscrapers, segmented and gridded by long lines of shuttles moving across their rolling landscape. After a moment, a small speck separated from one of the lines. As the speck came closer, a small delivery transport came into view, gliding down over the roof. An older model transport, the paint peeling a bit on the front, approached the street with no more than a slight hum, not a single flake of fallen snow stirring until it landed on the ground with a slight crunch. "Well, don't you look spiffed today?" called out the man dressed in a white uniform from head to toe. He blended quite well into the falling snow. The young man, on the other hand, stood clad in his finest cloth. His shoes were polished and his suit jacket was pressed. To top it off, he donned a rather expensive-looking wide-brimmed spacer's hat. The young man shook his head with an embarrassed smile. "Well, it's my mother's birthday, and I'd be remiss not to attend our annual picnic. It's always the same. We sit under the old cherry tree in the park with my blanket to lay on, homemade sandwiches to enjoy, and..." He paused as he was handed a small glass container. "A jug of milk to wash it all down." "Tell you what," the delivery man quipped, "I wish I could be as good a son as you." The weaved wood of the basket creaked softly under the added weight of the milk as the young man responded with a chuckle. "It's not like I'm stopping you," the delivery man snorted, stretching his jaw. "You've probably got it easy, I bet. Probably came out an angel, you did. Well, I popped out a bloody harpy. Last time I visited, I forgot to wipe my feet on the mat before I stepped on the carpet, and she bopped me, right in the eye. Can you believe that? Our own son." The young man had already started down the street, waving a hand over his shoulder, saying, "May I recommend wiping your feet next time?" The delivery man scoffed, but the young man had already gone over the crest of the hill. It was quite a walk to the old cherry tree in the park. One had to go through the old city, past the open-air bazaar, and take a stroll down the street Old Main. With a glance at both the time and the thickening clouds above, he decided a shortcut may be necessary. So the young man with the picnic basket full of milk, homemade food, and a blanket draped over his arm ducked down into a back alley to make his way to the old cherry tree in the park. The cold was more biting here, snow already sticking to the pavement, as only sparse rays of sunlight lit these paths. The alleys were narrow, below worn paths littered with glass of times past and above, oh so far away. The narrowest sliver of sky flanked by soaring hollow towers. The wind sung wailing epitaphs as it passed through the broken windows, empty offices, and halls. Their past grandeur was like an old photograph, edges creased and torn, that had become overexposed through the passage of time of a beautiful woman. It would be a forgettably mediocre sight at a glance, maybe even at a prolonged look, but if someone was there to tell you what it was, you could strain your eyes, filling in the missing gaps, making out the semblance of her beauty, and maybe even for a moment be awestruck by what it once was, but could never truly be beholden again. He strode along the twists and turns, whistling the merry tune echoing off the walls before dying away. His song and step stopped, however, when he discovered the latest alley he ventured into was blocked by the rubble of a small building, tufts of vegetation already growing in the remains. Well, he muttered to himself, that's not up to code. He held his chin in his hand, index finger tapping his nose as the sound of the bazaar carried faintly on the wind just beyond the barrier that blocked his way. He glanced to the tower on his left. It might lead around this blockage, he thought. He made his way up to the building, not with the crunch of snow on his boots, but the crunch of glass. The walls and the doors were nothing but vacant husks, their panes once adorned with beautiful murals that now lay all over the cobblestone steps. He knocked on the empty doorframe. "Hello?" He feigned unlocking the door with a key before stepping through and calling, "Just the new landlord checking up on the place, don't mind me." He finished his private performance with a locking of the door behind him and a large step forward into an unseen puddle of water. "Suppose we'll have to get the plumber out right away." Except for broken glass and broken pipes, the corridors were empty, cleared out long ago. It made for a lackluster view, but fairly easy navigation. Down one empty corridor to the center of the building and a quick right down yet another empty corridor. It went on and on like that. It wasn't until he had nearly exited the building that something caught his eye. He opened a set of double wooden doors and stumbled into a grand wide entranceway. The building itself curved upward, circled by desolate walkways to an opening at the top of this titan, allowing a thin, dim beam of sunlight to shine down on a small glass display supported by a thin metal rod. He walked forward under the legs of a large stone statue, the top half of which lay scattered across the lobby floor. The head lay upright, taller than he, next to the display, any distinctive features washed away by the wind and the rain. He peered curiously through the display glass, but years of dust and grime buildup couldn't be penetrated by the meager winter light. Darkness is all that he could make out within. The pitter-patter of pawed feet across the tiled floor caused his head to turn. In front of him, frozen mid-step, was a feline with thick white fur, no more than a foot long, but with a tail 3 times that length, which was standing straight up, frightened. Before he could utter a word, the top of the tail twitched once and the creature darted up the head to its apex. "Now aren't you a funny-looking thing?" he mused. It responded with a short hiss, and with a sound like the air leaving a balloon, it poofed into what could only be described as a white ball of fluff. Like a bad hairpiece it sat, only the little nubs of paws and eyes visible through what was presumably meant to be an intimidating display. "I take it back," the man laughed. "Now that is funny." He stood there, snow drifting in, hands on his hips, laughing at what he had to assume was one of the most ridiculous images he'd ever seen. Once he could contain his fits of laughter, he looked up saying, "Now I remember my mom teaching me about you, though I can't remember your name for the life of me. But she always said she could tell when you guys were agitated because of, well, that thing that you were doing," he said, pointing at the fluffy ball of fur. "That means I've angered you, and that's no way to treat such a wonderful entertainer, so perhaps a little rhyme my mother taught me will work out better." He stopped for a moment, removing the jug of milk and a small bowl from the basket. "To pet the fur that's smooth as silk, merely offer a bowl of milk." Before he had even finished pouring a small portion into the bowl, the kitten had scampered down the head of the statue, leapt to the ground, crossed in front of the display, and happily started lapping up the milk, its hair gently falling back into place with a purr. He ran his hand down the small feline squatting there in the falling snow, his jacket's hem just scraping the top of the first layer of snow dust. His eyes glazed over and, looking straight ahead, he spoke. "She brought you strays home every other week from the office when I was a kid. Having a soft spot for animals of all shapes and sizes is just part and parcel of being a vet, I suppose. Even ones of really quite odd shapes and sizes, present company included." The bowl now empty, the kitten looked up with an expectant meow. "Maybe not that big a soft spot. I need to keep some of this milk for myself. We always have a pint of milk at our picnic." Just as he began to put the milk away, he saw another ball of fluff pop out from under a piece of rubble, then another from a doorway down the hall, and then another and another. As the single expectant cry became an entire chorus, he reluctantly poured the rest of the milk into the bowl. The dissonant meows quickly subsided into a harmony of purrs. "I don't know what scares me more, not having milk at the picnic, or her knowing that I didn't feed you at all." As the last drop fell, he set the bottle down next to the circle of fluff and fur that surrounded his bowl. And so the young man with the picnic basket, lacking milk but full of homemade food and a blanket draped over his arm, set off once more to the old cherry tree in the park, the clouds a little thicker, the sun a little dimmer. It didn't take long, only a couple more turns, to reach the threshold of the bazaar. It emitted a cacophony, a mixture of the crowd's babbling chatter, the hawkers' cries and squeals of caged animals large and small, all their songs clashing against each other in the frigid afternoon air. Small fires flickering against the ruined buildings were lit here and there, keeping those around them warm, but most appreciated by all, they kept the smell of animal dung mostly at bay. The man paused only a moment before stepping into the flow of the crowd. Years of visiting this playground of food, trinkets, and baubles made him immune to the hawkers' cries. His feet felt as if they'd taken a step back in time, walking in the footsteps of his younger self, holding his mother's hand all those years ago. A quiet whimper cut through the deafening ambient noise, making his feet stop. In the middle of the stalls, a small girl no more than 9, with tears running down her cheeks, stood and, while the crowd was bustling around her, seemed to be very much alone. He pushed against the flow of the crowd, although the shouts and shoves accompanied him, to make his way over to the girl. Not a gentleman among the lot, he thought to himself, and, as he caught an elbow from a passing lady, added, nor a gentle woman. With a couple extra bruises, he reached the girl and knelt on one knee, dirt soiling the fabric, and asked her at eye level, "Child, is everything all right?" She shook her head violently back and forth, her simple braid flailing. "What about your parents? Do you know where they are?" The tears welled and her lips curled as she vehemently shook her head. "Come now, tell me, where did you see them last?" She shook and drooped her head once more, this time softly back and forth, rustling her small red cloak, one size too small, as she shivered in the falling snow. He looked around the bazaar, but no one had that panicked look in their eye, the look of a parent searching for a lost child. In a break in the crowd, he saw a small stone bench powdered in a thin layer of snow. Gently clasping her hand, he led her, clearing a way through the crowd, to the bench. Using his free hand, he swept the snow off, revealing a chipped surface marred by a crack that spanned the bench's breadth. After sitting her down, he draped the blanket over her shoulders. The shivering slightly subsided. "You know, I'm sure they're already looking for you. Probably just around the corner." The only response was sobs and the blanket being pulled more tightly across her shoulders as she pulled up her legs onto the bench, covering them as well. The man sat there, drumming his fingers across his leg, not more than a foot between them. Yet he felt the distance between them was really the length of the chasm in the pit of one's stomach as they desperately racked their mind for a way to comfort a stranger. So, quietly they sat, bathed in the ambiance of the buzzing bazaar as snow fell onto their slumped shoulders. Finally, he heard a sound from the girl. Not a word, but the rumble of her stomach. He gave a faint smile. Now, this was supposed to be for a picnic later, but he pulled the sandwich wrapped in plastic from his basket. There's no point in being sad and hungry now, is there? She looked at him and his outstretched offer of food, her eyes the only thing not under the blanket at this point. Her hands sheepishly emerged from her cocoon as she asked, "Are you sure?" "Yes, child. And besides, my mother would have my hide if I wasn't on my best behavior for a guest, and such a pretty one at that." For the first time, she gave a soft giggle and then took a bite from the sandwich, a little alvine jelly staining the corners of her mouth. Her shoulders straightened and sobs subsided completely now as she chewed. After a second bite, she asked, "What are you all dressed up for, mister?" Even with a small stain on the cuff of his shirt from traversing the abandoned building earlier, he did stand out from the rest of the crowd. No one else's pish could quite match his posh. "Well, I'm off to a picnic, and truthfully, my mother always preferred it when and I quote, dressed to impress." She licked her fingers, savoring the last bit of her meal as he continued. "Though, I do suppose this might look better on you." He placed the spacer's hat down over her head. A surprised squeal came from her lips as the brim of the hat fell well below her eyes. She looked up, pulling the hat back with a beaming grin. "It doesn't fit." He exaggerated in a gasp. "A fine hat such as this makes anyone look dashing, don't you think?" She giggled, trying to hand the hat back. "No!" In faux outrage, he responded, "Well, if it doesn't make me look dashing, why would I put it back on?" So he sat on the small bench in the middle of the thinning bazaar, entertaining a lost child as the snowdrift turned into a snowfall. The lowering sun cast the shadows of crumbling buildings upon the pair, and each moment, without fear of loss settling into their stomachs, was a momentary victory. Until they both heard a call in the air. "Hannah! Hannah, where are you?" The girl gasped and burst from the blanket, running towards the call as fast as her little legs would carry her. Watching her braid fly behind her, he dusted off the blanket and folded it before glancing at the time, which was now growing quite late. He saw the little girl, through the gaps in the crowd, hugging her mother, tears in both their eyes as they reunited. By the time the two separated and she scampered back to the bench, the man's hat in hand, she found that the young man with a picnic basket, now full of only memories, and a blanket draped over his arm, had already set off towards the old cherry tree in the park. With the bazaar at his back, the street widened into what was known as Old Main. He began to walk, running his hands through his hair. Maybe I should have cut it. She never likes it when it gets this long. The street, once packed with the traffic at all hours of the day, flanked by the finest buildings in the central artery of the city, now lay disheveled and disused. It seemed that one of the lines of shuttles lay directly above the street, almost mockingly. The very things that made it obsolete, laughing down at it from so far above. The young man's brisk pace eventually slowed, his feet covered to his ankle in snow at every step. Old Main was quite lengthy, and as he began to near its end, even he found the need to pull his jacket tight. As the inn came in sight like a light at the end of the tunnel, he saw a figure hunkered down next to a pile of brick and refuse. The young man stopped dead in his tracks. Even from this distance, he could tell the figure was dressed in little more than rags, blanketed by scraps of paper, his shoulders shaking almost violently, face buried in his chest. He hadn't yet seen the young man with the blanket draped across his arm. The young man glanced down. The blanket's colors had faded from years of use and its lining had begun to unravel slightly at the edges, but still between his fingers he fiddled with one of the corners in which was stitched, "From Martha to my little angel." A single step forward, The crunch of his boot against the sole of his shoe reverberated through the air. The wind seemed to die down, and eerie quiet settled in for a moment, until another crunch was heard. A third step disturbed the stillness of the air. Crunch. And then another rang like bells in his ear. Crunch. No sound except for the crunch. But even amongst the deafening thunder of his footsteps echoing in his ears, he could hear the sharp rattle of a can with a bit of change at the bottom as he stepped aside the homeless man. "Anything you can spare, lad?" His heart skipped a beat as he turned with a grimacing smile. "I'm sorry, good sir, all I have on me is a couple of coins." He deposited them into the can. They hit the bottom with a hollow, dull thud, as the homeless man thanked him. He began to take another step down Old Main, but he hesitated, rubbing the embroidered stitching in the blanket. "Shouldn't you be seeking some shelter? The night will be colder yet." The homeless man gave him a toothless grin through chattering teeth, coughing out, "I've survived colder winter than this, and I'll survive colder ones yet." The encounter lasted no longer than 30 seconds, but it felt so much longer than all the ones before. Even though the wind caught his jacket, causing it to flail wildly behind him, his arms were held loosely by his side. The sun now peeked out below the clouds, yet the air never felt colder. He put one foot in front of the other, until the man was a mere speck behind him, and he was at the end of Old Main. And so the young man with a picnic basket full of only memories and a blanket draped over his arm turned the last corner to see the old cherry tree in the park. This time of year the branches were bare, hanging low from the snow that covered them, and the only color on the tree was the dark, mucky brown of the bark. He only took a couple steps before he stopped, letting out a deep breath he didn't even realize he was holding in. It came out as a thick, vicious swirl that clouded the view in front of him. He looked down again at the stitching on his blanket. "From Martha, to my little angel." His fingers never let go of the corner the whole time. He gritted his teeth and let out an exasperated growl before turning back to Old Main. When he arrived back to the homeless man, who held quite a somewhat surprised look on his grimy face, the man looked down, his eyes unable to quite meet the gaze of the homeless man. With shoulders slightly sagged, he extended the blanket from an outstretched hand. "My mother is a knitter, and she'd give me a harsh word if one of her blankets wasn't keeping someone warm." The beggar started to get up. "Thank you, good sir, No, said the man gently, placing his hand on his shoulder. "Don't thank me, please. Thank the knitter." As the homeless man, a bit confused, but compliant, began to thank the maker of the blanket, the young man turned back with a picnic basket full of only memories and nothing else in his arms toward the old cherry tree in the park. He exited Old Main once more, his feet lighter than the last time he rounded the corner, but still heavier than when he left the bazaar. By that time the sun had begun to kiss the hills, framing the cherry tree ahead. The snow coated the tree like a regal coat, and the sunlight shone through the branches in bright streams. Each breath created a white puff of dragon smoke that was so magical to him as a child. As he moved forward, his feet no longer marched through the snow to meet hard pavement, but earth that gave ever so slightly on each step. As he reached the crest of the hill, he rested his hand on the tree. "You know, this climb seemed a lot easier as a boy," he said. He set down the basket and pulled out a small used candle and a match. He gently set the candle down in the snow, a wisp of smoke rising towards the branches. He then removed the last item from the basket. A small, aging photograph of a middle-aged woman, beautiful, smiling next to the man as a child. "I'm sorry, Mom, this isn't much of a picnic. There's no milk, no food, and no blanket. He lay in the snow in his finest cloth next to the photograph, looking at the sun setting through the branches of the old cherry tree in the park. But even lacking all that, I think you'd prefer it this way.
End of submission. Please update Chronicle submission status.
I know all of Fairwild's fables are filed as fiction, and I hope I don't take any flack for this, please set current submission to uncertain.
Compiled. Aberration to Standard Chronicle. Fairwild's fables. Protocol detected. Please justify.
You want to know why it's uncertain? That you're asking me why?
Please justify.
You've never done that
Please
before.
justify.
All right. Look, several of the early fables portray a very loving, optimistic mother figure. This is the last entry of any of the fables where that figure is mentioned. Now, while the true author of the fables isn't known, these descriptions do match up with some places in the Azaz system where they were believed to have lived. Anyway, some theorize that this is a story depicting Fairwild grieving and honoring his recently deceased mother. Now, this isn't a popular theory, partially because no one is even certain if Fairwild is a single author, but also because this entry marks a turning point in the fables towards a darker and more fatalistic direction, which would seem contrary to the story's ending, seeing as such a shift in tone would be the opposite of the earlier portrayed mother's personality. However, I personally think, while parts of the story are true depictions of Fairwild, the ending is a fiction of what Fairwild wished they could be. Something he yearned for but never could achieve. I think such a death in their life, being abandoned to the universe, led them to a more pessimistic view of the universe instead of the brighter outlook portrayed by the mother figure. But I better not let Eli hear me say that, otherwise he'll accuse me of rewriting history or treading on his beloved fables. In fact, it might be better if Eli never learned of this entry at all. Just delete this entry. Just delete it. No, don't delete it. Keep it. I'm sorry. Anyway, I'm not sure if that's what you were looking for, computer, but that's what I got.
Compiled. Database updated. Awaiting further submissions. Standby mode initiated.
This is A.B. Narayan. We hope you enjoyed tonight's episode of Bards Atlas. The Picnic was written by special guest author Brooks Mitchum. Fox was played by Preston Richard. Music and editing by Preston Richard. Bards Atlas is a narrative and lore-building podcast that follows Fox and Eli, two traveling bards seeking new knowledge and stories across the universe. If you'd like to get in touch with us or submit a work of art to inspire a future episode, send an email to bardsatlas@gmail.com or find us on Facebook and Twitter. Don't forget to leave a comment and a rating on iTunes. It'll really help us out a lot. And as always, thank you so much for listening.